Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances in the eastern section of the front line. The Russians have advanced near Terny, capturing a significant forest patch, allowing the Russians to progress further within the village. The Russians have advanced southwest of Viemka in the Siversk section of the front line. There's an advance in the northern parts of Chesev Yar, several advances in the southern flank and within the city of Toretsk. The Russians have managed to advance in the western parts of Pokrovsk, in the northern flank of Kurakhove and within the city itself, in the direction of Velika Novosilka and to the southwest of the settlements. Starting out in the south, following the Russian capture of the final road in and out of Neskushne, Vremivka and Velika Novosilka, the Russians are now capturing several fortified positions to the west of these positions, expanding their zone of control south of the road to develop offensive operations in the western flank of the settlement, bypassing the settlements themselves to fight over the fortified positions. The Russians are likely looking to flank their fortified positions northwest of Velika Novosilka rather than storming it directly head-on. This will be a combined strike from Novoyukomar to the east and a push through the western flank to flank the fortified positions from the western direction as well and putting them in a pincer. The Russians are also advancing northwest of Yasna Polyana in the direction of Rusliv, where there's been some fighting over the past few days, both to the south of the settlement and towards Konstantinopel, and a push towards Rusliv from the eastern direction as well. So a combined strike from the eastern and southern parts towards Rusliv and Konstantinopel in an attempt to cut off the supplies going in and out of Kurakhove. Within Kurakhove itself, the Russians have made a significant advance, progressing all the way to the eastern parts of the industrial area, gaining full control over the residential area of Kurakhove. This leaves only the industrial area under Ukrainian control. The Russians are within the southern outskirts and the eastern outskirts of the industrial area. With the control over Terny, with a river crossing through Vovcha River, they'll be able to advance and flank the industrial zone from the northern direction. But instead, it is likely that the Russians will focus more on the main highway between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove to flank the supply lines from the northern and southern direction, combined with the fighting over Rusliv and Konstantinopel, to completely cut off the supply lines going in and out of Kurakhove and encircling the wider Kurakhove area. With this significant advance within Kurakhove itself, the Ukrainian forces within the industrial area are now under heavy pressure to either withdraw or be encircled by the Russian forces. With the fighting reaching the industrial area, it has become much more difficult for the Ukrainians to withdraw from the area and out of the pocket that is forming from the northern and southern flanks. The Russians have advanced north in the direction of Novoyelisavetivka, where they've advanced along the eastern parts of the settlement, moving onwards to the western parts and onwards to Nadiivka, as Russians fight over the fortified positions and the settlements of the Ukrainians in the southwestern flank of Pokrovsk in the direction of the Dnieper region, right next to the border area, as the Russians look to gain full control over the defensive line of the Ukrainians south of Pokrovsk. The Russians continue their offensive operations in the Pokrovsk, Kurakhove, and Velika Novosilka directions to gain control over all of these three settlements in the coming weeks. In the Toretsk direction, the Russians have made several advances. They've managed to capture several fortified positions along the car racing track southwest of Toretsk. They've managed to capture the hill to the south of the southern district, fighting over the remaining fortified positions in between the Russian positions from the southwest and the northeast. The Russians are putting them in a pincer, cutting off their supplies and gaining full control over the southern district, then push along the fortified positions and gain full control over those southwest of Toretsk and gain full control of the southern flank. The Russians have been pushed back from the school area here in Sherbenivka and outside of the settlement. Their push towards the northern parts was defeated as the Russians, similar to Leonidivka, stretched out thinly and were spread out thinly, and Russian forces did not manage to establish proper supply lines. This led to Ukrainians grouping up on their forces, forcing a withdrawal. Whether they withdrew or were defeated, it is not clear, but the Russians do not control the area west of Sherbenivka, and the connection between Novopaske and Sherbenivka has been restored. The Russians are fighting over the fortified positions. This was likely results of a distraction by the Russian forces near Shcherbinivka. This has led to a weakening of the fortified positions here southwest of Toretsk, and with the progress within the city itself, the Ukrainians see their positions southwest of the city as weakened and vulnerable, and this has led to several Russian advances in these weakened Ukrainian fortified positions. The Russian advance within the city itself goes through the main residential area. Following the mall, the Russians are fighting over the residential areas northwest of these locations, moving towards the hill in the western parts of Toretsk. The Russians are now fighting over a Krymsky and industrial area in the northern parts of Toretsk, as well as the remaining hills in the western outskirts of the city. Following that, there is the fortified positions and a couple of settlements here to the west of Toretsk. This will lead the Russians to advance towards the city of Konstantinivka in the northwestern direction. Following Toretsk itself, there's not a lot of urban areas ahead of Konstantinivka. Instead, it is several layers of fortified positions that the Russians would have to fight through. It is unlikely that there will be significant progress following the capture of Toretsk, as the Ukrainians have several lines to fall back to. Instead, what it does is it opens up the several layers of fortified positions north of the city of Avdiivka. The Russians have managed to flank these fortified positions, gain control over Romanivka and Surya here in the northern parts. They'll be able to advance and connect with an assault towards Selenopole and Alexandropol from the northwest of Ocheretine in an effort to encircle this massive fortified area north of Avdiivka, and will open up the road from Avdiivka north of Donetsk towards Constantinople from the southern direction, expands the front line of the Russians south of Konstantinivka, and allow for significant progress in this direction. The objective would be to fight over the fortified positions of the main highway between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, which will be weakened by the siege of Pokrovsk, limiting supplies coming from the western direction. It will also create an additional layer of defenses between the Russian positions in Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, preventing for a large-scale counterattack by the Russians from the northern direction, and instead will have additional layers of defensive capabilities for the Russians to continue their offensive operations along Pokrovsk. If they leave their northern flank and eastern flank exposed, even if the Russians manage to capture Pokrovsk, they'll be vulnerable to a counterattack, where the Russians can be attacked in the direction of Avdiivka or near Pokrovsk, and they could be pushed back, negating significant portions of their offensive gains. Therefore, following the capture of Toretsk, it's likely that the Russians will focus their efforts here in the western direction rather than in the northern direction, as the city of Chasiv Yar still remains under Ukrainian control. Until the Russians capture that, then the Battle of Konstantinivka will not begin. If the Russians do capture Chasiv Yar and capture Toretsk at about the same time, the Russians will look to connect the two sides from Chasiv Yar in the north to Toretsk in the south, where the Russians would have control over the high ground, which will weaken the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians and allow the Russians to start the siege of Konstantinivka from the eastern, northern, and southern directions. Moving up to Chasiv Yar, the Russians have advanced further within the northern parts of the city. The Russians continue fighting over the eastern residential area, the main industrial area and apartment complex area in the central parts of the city, and the northern parts of the city, with the fortified positions of the Ukrainians located in the area. The majority of the Ukrainian fortified positions in the northern parts of Chasiv Yar, including these several lines, are mostly artillery firing positions and not actual trenches, anti-tank ditches, and so on. This makes it easier for the Russians to capture these fortified positions and actually take control of them and use them themselves as firing positions for offensive operations towards Konstantinivka, Druskivka, and so on along the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line. In the Siversk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced south of Vyimka, where they are advancing further along the open fields in the area, securing their flanks for further pushes down to the southern flanks of Siversk itself. The Russians are unable to advance further north of Vyimka, with the high ground and fortified positions remaining under Ukrainian control. Therefore, they're now focusing on connecting the eastern and western flanks to advance further along the railways and up towards the southern flank of Siversk itself, which the Russians are just a few kilometers away from. In the Terny direction along the Serbets River line, the Russians have captured the first patch that was under Ukrainian control east of the settlement and the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in that area. With this, they have an additional supply road in and out of Terny, and they are able to advance further within the settlement and start moving towards Yampolivka itself. These advances allow the Russians to now start a push to gain full control over Terny and move towards Yampolivka, which will expand the offensive operations in the area and allow them to concentrate more forces in the direction of Toretsk to potentially gain control over the settlement, which is a choke point which has prevented Russian advances towards the city of Liman, here west of Kremenna. The Russians have attempted to gain control over Torskit, then push into Liman, but has so far failed over the past year. But now that the Russians have advanced along the Serbets river line, they are able to reach the outskirts of Torskit from the eastern and northern directions for further offensive operations along the fortified areas towards Torskit itself, which has been very difficult for the Russians to advance through due to the Ukrainian drone coverage in the area. The Russians have faced a lot of difficulties and challenges in 2024 along with their offensive operations, which they have had the initiative all throughout 2024. The Ukrainians started their Kursk incursion to regain the initiative and stop Russian offensive operations, but the Russians carried on and prioritized the Donetsk region and the eastern section of the front line over the Kursk region, which had led to the Russians continuing their offensive operations to gain full control over the region. The Ukrainians have been unable to reverse the situation in the east, and they are unable to expand their control in the Kursk region, and this confirms that the theory that I've had that the Russians conduct offensive operations at a rate that is sustainable to be correct, as they have continuously been speeding up the offensive operations bit by bit throughout 2024, and despite the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, they didn't manage to gain any significant breakthrough. They didn't manage to reverse the situation. They didn't manage to pull off another Kharkiv offensive where they regained a significant part of territory. Instead, it ended up being a death trap for themselves, where they ended up getting stuck in an area that is out in the open fields, where they are wasting a lot of their elite troops in a meat grinder. And this has ended up being another Bakhmut over another Kharkiv offensive. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.